Imagine finding out that someone who has never, even set foot in your state has exactly the same voting power as you do.
Yeah, it definitely forces you to rethink everything you thought you knew about how our local elections actually work.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're unpacking a massive stack of sources. We've got active lawsuits, official state election manuals, radio interviews, news reports, you name it.
And it's worth noting right up front that because we're dealing with election data right before people head to the polls, these sources are highly, highly partisan.
Oh, absolutely. And we are not here to take sides. Our mission today is just to look under the hood of all these arguments, strip away the politics, and figure out exactly what is going on.
Right. Just the math and the laws.
Exactly. Who gets to vote and who gets purged from the rolls.
We definitely have a lot of ground to cover today. I mean, the legal friction over voter data has just reached a total boiling point.
It really has. So, to set the stage for you, let's hit a fast 90-second news hook. Right now, Virginia is basically ground zero for the battle over the ballot box.
The Republican National Committee just sued Virginia to block never residents, which are people who have never lived in the state, from casting ballots. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice hit Virginia with heavy federal lawsuits for, hiding voter data and systematically purging voter lists way too close to an election.
Right.
At the exact same time, Democratic Governor Abigail Spanberger just signed an executive order pulling Virginia back into a massive interstate voter tracking network called ERIC. So it's a total collision of state laws, federal rules, and partisan strategies, all happening right as ballots go out.
The sheer volume of the litigation here, it really just shows a system under immense stress. You've got states fighting the federal government, political parties fighting the states,
Right.
and legal teams are battling over the actual database codes that verify our identities.
It's wild. Let's start with that first lawsuit, though, because the core concept sounds almost impossible. How does someone who's never lived in a state legally vote there?
It sounds like a glitch, right? But it's actually a real legal pathway. So the RNC, along with a voter named Matthew Hurt and the RITE PAC, they sued the Virginia State Board of Elections. And they're targeting a very specific state law that handles overseas voters.
Yeah, this is where it gets interesting.
Under current Virginia code, the adult children of U.S. citizens who were born abroad and who have never spent a single day living in the U.S.,
No, one day.
they are actually allowed to register and vote in Virginia. They just claim the last Virginia address where their parent or legal guardian was eligible to vote.
Right, and the legal argument here centers on a direct clash between a state statute and the state constitution. Because the RNC points out that the Virginia Constitution has extremely strict rules about physical presence.
Which makes sense.
Yeah. Article 2, Section 1 mandates that a voter must actually be a resident of the Commonwealth and, crucially, a resident of the specific local precinct where they cast their vote.
And a statute passed by the legislature can't just, override the core state constitution.
Exactly. That is the exact argument. The lawsuit claims that allowing these overseas voters creates this, what they call a legal fiction of inherited residency.
Inherited residency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The plaintiffs argue that by basically manufacturing voters out of people who have never physically lived in a precinct, the state unlawfully dilutes the voting power of actual physical Virginia residents.
Right. The people who actually pay local taxes and live under local laws. So they're asking the court to cancel these registrations and basically block those specific absentee ballots from being counted. It feels like it's like inheriting your parents' local gym membership, but you've never even visited the country where the gym is located.
That's a great way to put it.
You just open the app and vote on what the gym's new hours should be, affecting everyone who is actually sweating on the treadmills.
And just like an app, the mechanism of how they got that access is this weird mix of old rules and new expansions. Well, if we look at the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, which is commonly called UOCRAVA, this federal law passed back in 1986. And it originally had a very clear purpose. It was to protect the voting rights of active military personnel who were deployed overseas.
Right. I mean, if you're stationed in Germany for the Army, you obviously shouldn't lose your right to vote in your hometown. That makes perfect sense. But how did we leap from deployed soldiers to, civilians who have never stepped foot on American soil?
Mission creep.
Yeah.
And shifting demographics, honestly. Over time, those federal protections expanded to include civilian federal employees abroad and eventually just private civilian expatriates.
Okay.
The sources actually note a massive shift. By the 2020 election, civilian overseas voters actually eclipsed military overseas voters.
Wait, really?
Yeah. And as states updated their own legal codes to comply with this expanding federal mandate, states like Virginia created a legal category called a covered voter.
Yeah.
This explicitly allows an individual born outside the United States, who has never resided in the Commonwealth, to legally piggyback on their parents' last eligible address.
So the RNC is arguing that in trying to accommodate this federal law, state lawmakers stretched the rules completely past the breaking point, like shattering the physical residency rules that are set in stone by the Virginia Constitution.
Yes, exactly. They argue the state legislature basically gave away sovereignty over its own local elections. And, Virginia is just one theater in a much wider conflict here.
Which brings us to the national strategy, because I listened to a radio interview on Chicago's Morning Answer with Ally Triolo. She's the director of election integrity for the RNC.
Right.
And the scale of their operation is just staggering. Triolo notes they're driving over 120 active election integrity cases across 30 different states.
They're essentially auditing the entire national voter registration system through the courts. It's massive. In that interview, Criollo cited data from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. It showed that out of 60 million voter records reviewed, roughly 300,000 were flagged as potentially improper.
And those flags, they trigger when cross-referencing finds individuals who are deceased or unpardoned felons or non-citizens.
Right.
And Triolo noted that more than half the states hadn't even complied with the data requests yet, meaning that 300,000 number is likely just the tip of the iceberg.
And this aggressive litigation pairs directly with a major push on Capitol Hill. Specifically, we're talking about the Save America Act.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of the Save Act, because this is really where the two opposing philosophies of election security collide.
Yeah, it's a federal bill, currently stalled in Congress, that requires documentary proof of citizenship and a photo ID in order to register and vote in federal elections.
Right. So the proponents argue our current verification infrastructure is entirely built on an honor system. When you register at the DMV under the National Voter Registration Act, you basically just check a box swearing you are a citizen.
Right. There's no paper backup required.
Exactly. So Triola argues in her interview that without requiring physical documentary proof, the verification gaps are just too wide. They allow non-citizens to slip onto the rolls. They basically view opponents of the bill as simply wanting to leave those vulnerabilities open.
But then you have opponents of the Save Act, including Virginia Democratic Senators Tim Kaine and Mark Warner. They point to the unintended damage to the system.
The collateral damage, basically.
Exactly. They argue the bill will disenfranchise millions of valid legal citizens. Because, providing documentary proof of citizenship sounds simple until you look at the logistics of it.
Right, like passports are expensive. A lot of people just don't have them.
Passports are expensive, birth certificates are hard to track down. But more importantly, millions of married women have current legal names that no longer match the maiden names printed on their original birth certificates.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So proving their identity requires a really complex paper trail of marriage licenses and court documents. It's a huge hurdle.
But let's look at the numbers for a second. If we look at the Brennan Center for Justice data from the 2016 election, they analyzed 23.5 million votes cast across 42 jurisdictions, and they found only 30 suspected cases of non-citizens voting. 30 out of 23 million. That is a massive statistical anomaly. So why launch 120 lawsuits and push massive federal legislation over a fraction of a percent?
It's a fair question. And it's because the two sides are measuring entirely different types of risk.
What do you mean?
Well, for proponents of strict laws like the Save Act, a low number of confirmed illegal votes doesn't really matter if the system itself is wide open. They argue the mere existence of verification loopholes destroys public trust. They want the digital front door deadbolted, even if very few people are actively trying to pick the lock.
And the opponents look at that deadbolt and realize it will jam, basically locking millions of legitimate homeowners out of their own house. They argue the strict cure causes far more damage than the disease.
Exactly. It's a fundamental debate over whether the system should prioritize absolute lockdown security or maximally accessible participation. And with federal bills like the Save America Act stalled out in the Senate, that debate just gets pushed down to the states.
It becomes a street-level fight over how local registrars manage their voter rolls day to day.
Yeah, and the mechanics of that list maintenance are actually fascinating.
We pulled the official Virginia Department of Elections handbook for this, and Chapter 8 dictates the rules that local registrars actually follow to purge voters. We always picture someone crossing names off a ledger with a pen, but it is heavily automated. The state relies on constant, massive streams of data.
Right. So, for example, the Department of Motor Vehicles sends daily updates on address changes or citizenship flags.
Okay.
And the Department of Health sends weekly lists of all persons 17 years of age or older who have died.
Weekly lists.
Yeah. Plus, the Central Criminal Records Exchange provides monthly lists of people convicted of felonies. Local registrars then have 30 days to act on all this data and cancel registrations.
But matching that data isn't as simple as it sounds. I mean, if the Department of Health says John Smith died, how does the registrar know which of the 5,000 John Smiths in Virginia to actually purge?
It's tough. They have to match dates of birth, partial Social Security numbers, address histories. The algorithms have to be incredibly precise.
And state-level data has a massive blind spot, right?
Yeah.
State lines. People move from Virginia to Maryland every single day. And Virginia's DMV doesn't just automatically talk to Maryland's DMV.
Which brings us directly to Governor Spanberger signing the executive order for Virginia to rejoin the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC.
Let's talk about ERIC. What is it?
So ERIC is essentially the IP solution to that interstate blind spot. It's a nonpartisan data sharing coalition among member states. It pulls voter registration data, motor vehicle data, Social Security death records, and even Postal Service change of address information.
Let's explain how ERIC actually securely handles all this, because states can't just, email plain text spreadsheets of Social Security numbers to each other. ERIC uses a process called cryptographic hashing.
Right. Hashing acts like a one-way digital shredder. Before a state sends its data to ERIC, the software converts sensitive information, like a driver's license number, into a randomized string of characters. That's the hash.
So John Smith, DOB 1980, becomes something like A7X9L2P.
Exactly. And Maryland's system uses the exact same hashing algorithm. So if Maryland uploads A7X9L2P as a new driver's license registration, ERIC sees that the hash matches one in Virginia's voter file.
But ERIC never actually knows it's John Smith.
Nope. It just tells Virginia, hey, this specific hashed identity just popped up in Maryland. You should probably check your rolls.
Yeah.
It flags voters who have moved, died out of state, or are registered in multiple jurisdictions.
It's a brilliant piece of engineering. Yet former Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin pulled Virginia out of the ERIC network entirely.
He did.
Our sources show he did this following heavy conservative criticism, joining several other Republican-led states that abandoned the compact. The critics argued ERIC lacked transparency and was secretly pushing left-leaning voter registration drives.
And it illustrates perfectly how data architectures become weaponized. I mean, Spanberger rejoining ERIC immediately reverses Youngkin's policy, proving that even the algorithms used to clean the databases are subject to this intense partisan tug-of-war.
And when states start pulling out of data-sharing networks and changing how they clean their rolls, well, the federal government steps in, which leads us to the two major Department of Justice lawsuits against Virginia.
Right.
First, Attorney General Pamela Bondi sued Virginia for simply refusing to hand over its full voter registration list for public inspection.
Right.
She argued that accurate voter rolls are the foundation of election integrity, and failing to meet federal transparency obligations just flat out violates the law.
And then the second DOJ lawsuit gets into the deep mechanics of federal election law. The Justice Department sued Virginia over the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, the NVRA. This one is huge. It is. The NVRA enforces a strict 90-day quiet period right before any federal election.
During this 90-day window, states are legally blocked from systematically removing voters from the rolls. It's like freezing the core code of a massive software platform 90 days before launch.
That's a perfect analogy.
You don't push major updates right before going live, because if a patch has a bug, the entire system crashes and you literally have no time to fix it.
Exactly. The NVRA quiet period is a fail-safe mechanism. It's designed to prevent eligible, legal voters from being mistakenly swept up in large-scale automated purges.
Because errors happen.
Always. When a state runs an algorithm to remove 10,000 potentially ineligible voters, there is always an error rate. False positives happen. And if a valid voter gets caught in a purge in late October due to, say, a matching error, they won't find out until they actually show up at the polling place on Election Day.
And by then, the registration deadline has passed. They are completely disenfranchised by a database glitch.
Right.
But Governor Youngkin argued fiercely against this DOJ lawsuit. He stated he was simply enforcing a Virginia state law that requires the immediate removal of non-citizens from the voter rolls. He called the DOJ's interference unprecedented. So does the 90-day federal freeze actually protect non-citizens from being removed?
That is the crux of the legal showdown right there. The federal quiet period strictly prohibits systematic programs, meaning massive algorithmic sweeps. But it does allow states to remove individual voters if they get specific, individualized information, like a signed letter from the voter or a direct criminal conviction record.
But if a state DMV algorithm spits out a list of 5,000 names flagged as non-citizens in mid-October, the DOJ says you cannot touch them until after the election.
Precisely. The federal government argues the risk of accidentally deleting legitimate citizens in a rushed systemic sweep is just too high. The NVRA mandates that routine maintenance must be finished long before that 90-day window begins.
But the state of Virginia, however, argued that leaving known ineligible voters on the rolls right up to Election Day compromises the integrity of the entire vote. They basically asked why a federal paperwork deadline should shield illegal registrations.
It's a phenomenal collision of duties. I mean, the state is legally bound to keep the list accurate, and the federal government is legally bound to protect eligible voters from administrative chaos.
And as the courts navigate this, it exposes just how fragile the administrative layer of our democracy really is.
It really does.
We have covered incredible ground today. We started with the fight over never-resident voters claiming inherited residency through decades-old federal overseas laws.
We unpacked the national strategy driving those 120 lawsuits and the deep systemic debate over the Saving America Act's documentary proof requirements.
And finally, we looked at the massive automated data streams that manage our voter files. From the partisan battle over cryptographic data sharing in ERIC to the intense federal standoff over the 90-day purge freeze.
All of this highlights a reality that most voters never see. I mean, we tend to focus heavily on the campaigns, the speeches, the candidates, but the actual act of voting is governed by invisible administrative rules, complex data sharing agreements, and really high-stakes legal battles over state sovereignty.
So true.
Those unseen mechanisms ultimately dictate how secure the ballot box is and whether a legitimate voter faces a sudden, unexplainable roadblock on Election Day.
It really reframes the whole concept of election integrity for you. As our lives move entirely into the digital realm and states rely on increasingly vast algorithms to cross-reference our identities, match our histories, and track our movements, the physical voting booth itself almost feels secondary. Will the future of our democracy depend less on the physical ballot you cast and more on who writes the matching code in the database? Something to think about.